Hello and welcome, everybody, to our episode of the Graeyzone. Today, I'm here with...
Christian Coloros.
Silas Abdullah.
I'm not going to give you my last name, but you'll know it. Yeah, you'll know it anyways. And today, we'll be discussing aesthetic and function in a lot of different ways. So Christian will be discussing function. Silas will be discussing aesthetic. And to get us started, we're going to get a brief description of both. Christian, why don't you go ahead and define function?
Function is the idea of imparting utility to an object, person, or other idea to allow it to function as it would, i.e., saying that a milk jug purpose is to hold milk. It's imparting a function to it.
Mm-hmm.
And then Silas, let's get the aesthetic definition.
Well, aesthetics, or the value of aesthetics, is the nature of beauty, art, and taste held by an object, event, or state of affairs. So that would play into like jewelry, I guess you could say, having a quality of beauty attached to the object of itself.
Yeah, not a lot of function.
Not a lot of function, no.
With that, we have milk jug is high function, low aesthetic, and jewelry is high aesthetic, low function.
Right.
So we're going to talk about some things that meet in the middle, in the gray area.
Whoa.
If you will. So we're going to start by talking about something that a lot of people use every day, especially if you're in the U.S. And that is the automobile, or the car, if you will. So Christian's going to give us a brief talk about the function of an automobile.
What do they do?
What does a car do?
Automobiles. Anyways, automobiles are incredibly important in our everyday life because they allow most Americans to travel from point A to point B, wherever those points may lead.
We're not judging, don't worry.
We aren't judging. Maybe.
Unless you're in Alaska and they just don't have roads that go there.
Yeah, it's just a circle. But the functionality of automobiles, cars, trucks, tanks, those aren't really automobiles, but still, is that they allow the transportation of humans and other things to different areas, and this has greatly improved our society because it allows quick transportation as opposed to a horse and buggy. To further elaborate, a horse and buggy has the same function, but the function of an automobile is greatly improved from it. They both allow
It kind of evolved from that form, right?
It did. Yeah. And so it is an improved, upgraded form. They both allow transportation from point A to B, but one does it better than the other.
The horses do, right?
Yeah, the horses are better. And also square wheels. Anyways, so on the point of square wheels having a very strange aesthetic, let's go with aesthetic now.
Well, I think that a square wheel would be pretty aesthetic, but the functionality would be low. Anyways,
but it does function.
It does function.
Look it up.
We've looked it up. It can happen. Anyways, that's beyond the point. The aesthetic of an automobile. I mean, have you ever noticed how all cars kind of have a similar feature towards it? It's got that smooth design. You know, it's a shell almost, you would say. And they have pretty similar features like where windows are located and everything. That's because the way that it works looks good, right? So that's the entire purpose of aesthetic value, is that if it's looking good it looks good while it's doing whatever it's doing, whether it has a function or not that's like pertaining towards it.
So to give you a bone in that same vein, this is the case because we live by Greenfield Village, but Greenfield Village has an aesthetic because they actually do have horses and buggies.
Right.
And yeah, it's not really effective to get you from point A to point B, but it has that aesthetic that people
right, exactly. You're trying to match what's going on in that.
Yes.
The aesthetic, the nature of art and beauty in that sense is pertaining towards old colonial American times and past historical events.
And so
Greenfield Village, real quick. Greenfield Village is an outdoor museum, I guess you could say, that's located here in Dearborn, that has a bunch of old houses, old structures, and it creates a
rustic feeling.
Exactly,
of the times.
Of like the 1700s and earlier, later, but not by a lot. Like 1800s to 1700s?
It's about 1700s to tens.
Yeah, very early age. But
Edison's house.
so with that though, like Christian, what you were saying was correct. Yes, the aesthetic of that area is being held by the things that they're putting in there. The nature of objects that they're putting in there.
And so with that, even though I do feel that function is more important for a car because it allows you to get from point A to point B, the aesthetic of it represents kind of the times. It's a reflection of the times.
So
because if you
aesthetic,
live in the 50s,
right? The aesthetics of times change, right? That's been known. The reason that we don't have what are those flaring pants called? Bell bottoms, bell bottoms, and funky wigs on or funky hairdos is because we don't live in the 70s anymore, you know, or like what your chinos,
Janko jeans.
Janko jeans, that's what they are.
Yeah, the big
Janko jeans, the really big one.
The big ass pocket with the really.
Shout out to the 90s, by the way.
We're talking about like the jeans that people in the early 2000s with
90s and 2000s, yeah.
The Janko jeans, they are ridiculous.
They're like bell bottoms, but they're
they're like Bella everything. It's actually
they're Bella everything. Yeah.
It's not. It's like
I will put a picture of Janko jeans on, but
are we talking about those jeans that people that would stereotypically listen to like Korn?
No, Avril Lavigne wore these are Janko jeans.
Yeah.
It's
excessive fabric. ICP, that's what it is.
Like Korn, ICP. Some people would wear chains with them.
Those are trip pants.
Those are
but the
trip
jean
pants,
ones I'm talking about.
The jeans are Janko jeans, but
I know what trip pants are.
Shuffle pants or whatever.
Shuffle pants.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, that's what.
Yeah.
Trip is a brand. Yeah.
Janko jeans. So yeah, I mean the reason that we're not wearing those right now is because our aesthetic has evolved.
Also, they have very low function too.
They get wet because you wear them outside and then they
drag
up.
Yeah,
and they're hard to move around. They weigh so much. Those pants weigh a ton.
But why is it that people wore those things?
Because they looked.
They had a style.
They looked cool.
It doesn't matter. Look, listen, we've evolved.
It looked cool.
The reason
we've evolved since the early 2000s.
The reason that aesthetic value is so important is shown here because people will literally forego functionality just so they can look a certain way. You know, they getting your Janko jeans all wet just because you want to go out with your friends and look like you're having a good time back in the 90s, 2000s.
I mean, the fact... I don't think you have yet. You haven't cosplayed, have you?
No, not really. I mean, I've dressed up and shit. Never.
But we cosplay.
When I wore Shigaraki's hand on my face, literally
could
someone
not
had
see.
to guide me around a con because I couldn't see.
Right.
That is.
Should we put up a picture of you?
Very little function in that costume. Couldn't see shit.
You see, now this builds upon the premise that aesthetic is something that we can use and we can enjoy because we have leisure time.
Right. Yeah. Well, aesthetic value is a leisurely process. However, in today's day and age, it's so important.
Yeah, and we'll get more into that.
Yeah.
We have a second half of this, so I'm going to kind of just get us back on track more. This is more of a discussion for the second half. So we were talking about cars. Now we want to talk about food and the aesthetic and function of food. And function of food is highly important. So we're going to start with Christian a lot because function is usually the primary step, and then aesthetic comes after.
So it always does.
The function of food is a really interesting history. I won't go too much into it because I could talk for a long time on it. But food is primarily used to feed us, and that's the primary basis. But humans, because we've evolved to have taste buds and other things and other senses like smell, we really like the aesthetics of food, and it's something that people for hundreds and thousands of years have strived to improve and at times have even killed over, such as during the spice trades and the imperialism in the 16s through 1800s, in which colonial powers invaded the Spice Islands and other places like that to collect flavor, essentially, spices, to improve their food back home. So
people died so that other people's food could taste good.
The primary important thing about food is the fact that it has function, and because we need to eat, all these other things are added on top of it.
Right.
Such as, I'll say, if we didn't need to eat, the ingestion of food would be much more like a hobby. Like some people would, some people
Right.
wouldn't. But because everybody needs to eat, it makes everybody want its aesthetic to be pleasing.
Well, like you're throwing me a bone. I appreciate it. I'm gonna throw you a bone too. I mean,
Wait, real quick.
what's up?
Eating is still a hobby, if you ask me.
Okay,
I
look.
love to
Eating
eat.
is a hobby. I'm not gonna deny
But
that.
it
No, I
is
get what
something-
To
you're
a certain
saying,
degree,
yeah.
it's very
It can
essential.
still be a hobby, but it's also a
Like,
necessity
the,
right
the,
now.
the thing is that
Probably forever.
like what Christian was saying, you know, our taste buds have evolved, our sense of smell has evolved, to a point where we can appreciate fine dining, I guess you could say.
And breathing.
And breathing.
So, but like, you know, if we're going back to primitive times, I mean, people didn't have a choice really. I mean, sure, there was some sort of aesthetic value there. People like to say that the paleo diet is like, you know, reminiscent of those times, like it's all simple foods and everything. However, you know, the point of what I'm trying to say is that even back then, you know, the functionality of food, it's superior. It is superior. However, Christian, what you were saying with, you know, our evolution and the aesthetic value that's been given to food, it's really allowed for us to explore beyond what food can be. You know, instead of just throwing a piece of meat over the fire, we can figure out what's going on. Or, you know what, substitute meat altogether. Fuck it, go tofu. You know, like we have evolved beyond any sort of primitive need for food, and now we're into an era where we can appreciate food as an art form.
Yeah, like
But the core premise is that people need to eat.
People need to eat,
so
and that's what makes it so
what I
important.
was gonna say is like think about small course dining where you eat like it's like
Yeah, you're not eating
you
to
eat
survive there.
9 plates of like I don't know food this big. That's all. That's like
Avant-garde
yeah.
cuisine.
It's almost all aesthetic. Like
Or what about those areas that like they have like specific like gimmicks, I guess they do with food eating, like you eat in the dark or everyone's naked.
I've heard of the last
I've
one.
heard of the last one, but there's actually a really interesting description that I learned about. I'm a culinarian by background, but
Fucking loves this
when
food.
I learned in culinary school, I learned about not an incident, but an experiment that one chef artist did, and it was I forget the actual name that it had, but it was everything was all in white, all the food.
I read about this. The white
And-
cube.
Yes.
Experiment,
And
yeah,
so a chef, decided he wanted to kind of break apart people's general perceptions of food, and he took the essence or the flavor of each food, and over a course of a long time, he figured out how to actually put them into like cubes and still get the exact same taste. But the cubes all had the same consistency,
So
and
they're
they were
all
white.
yeah, they're all look
And
the
so
same.
He then proceeded to deliver each cube and to people, and then he would ask them what it tasted like. And for the most part, people didn't know what it actually tasted like. They would guess something and they would think it tasted that way, but they wouldn't actually know because most people use the aesthetic of food to determine what it is. Now, in the functional side of things, people still need to eat, and that's actually
Well,
the
okay,
most
so
important thing.
yeah,
But
the functionality of food is established, right?
Yes, it's
When
established,
People
but-
eat food. Put that on a shirt. Call it a good day. That's a logo for life.
people eat food. You need food to survive.
You need food to
But
live.
Continuing with this, there were cases in which one of these cubes might have been flavored like a strawberry, and somebody might have said something completely different or something similar, but most people could not guess what it was unless they were to actually close their eyes. In which case, when they closed their eyes, they had a better chance
They're figuring out
of
what it was.
figuring it out.
Yeah,
because they weren't looking at the cube and assuming, okay, this is something different, in which all these ideas come to mind because of the visual aesthetic, but they were just relying on the things that they could without the change in the visual aesthetic, such as taste.
That's very interesting. I think that's a really cool. I have not actually heard of that experiment, but
So, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to note that that's a really interesting experience, and it really shows the importance of aesthetic and presentation when it comes to food.
Let's cut for a minute and come back.
Anyways, we were discussing aesthetic and function in everyday objects, We last talked about food. Now we're going to talk more about phones. And phones have very high function. They still, granted, have aesthetic. So I'm actually going to have Silas talk about the aesthetic evolution phones, or just aesthetic about phones. And I'm going to give it to Christian because he's got a bit of a longer piece on the function of a phone.
So, looking primarily at the aesthetic of phones, today, I'll start with today. I'll let Christian cover the functionality of everything. Christian's going to go. Where are you going to go?
He's going to get out of the shot.
Where are you going? Go do your thing.
Sorry, I just realized I didn't want to go upstairs to find it, but I realized it was actually down here.
Oh, look at that! Oh my goodness.
Okay.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, here's an old example of a flip phone. As you can see, it's quite a bit different than today's phone. Primarily the fact that my phone is a piece of glass that you touch a lot. And here we have the one of the originals, OG gangster phones. The dial.
Use this phone.
It's called a rotary phone.
You would use a rotary phone only if you needed to kill somebody.
Only. And trust me, it's really when you're dialing it, it's very ambiguous, but you do have the function of hanging up, like slamming the phone.
Yeah,
you can't. What are you gonna do nowadays? You're gonna press the end button. You can't, and if you throw it down, you break your phone, which is unfortunate.
Same with the clamshell phones. You could do one of my favorite hang-up sound effects is.
Oh, great!
Oh,
crisp, very crisp. So, I mean, that's just a general aesthetic thing. As you can see, we've evolved to have the primary function of earpiece to mouthpiece, and having a display on it and everything, which is great. I mean, back in the old days, you didn't have a display, right? However, I think Christian, I'm gonna hand it off to you because the functionality of a phone is very important.
So the functionality of a phone, first, I just want to say, before phones and before telegrams, you had letters. You had to write somebody a letter and somehow send it to somebody else to get word across from point A to point B, especially as in the cars. Cars just allow the travel. Phones allow the communication. Mm-hmm. Telegrams had to be laid out in these long lines, and still you could get a telegram, but it still needed to be delivered to you, so it was still kind of like a letter.
And you had to know Morse code.
Yeah.
Well, the Morse code people, yeah.
But
don't have those jobs
phone,
anymore.
with the advent of phones,
Thanks,
it
Obama.
allowed people to talk from very long distances, and even short distances in which it would just be inconvenient to one another. Without having to write a letter, you could just talk to them, and you can hear their inflection in their voice and a bunch of other things. And so phones have evolved greatly.
So not only are you getting like what you want to communicate, but you're communicating how it is that you're doing it.
It's easier to lie back in the day.
Easier to cover up your intentions.
And because of the function, which is communication, and people constantly want to have more and more utility, more and more functionality, phones have evolved into what we have today. I believe the first phones you could have that were more mobile, besides military phones, were in the late 70s in a car.
Yeah, you had car phones, and then you also had the backpack phones, or like the satchel phones, where it's like the whole unit's
but then
there.
During the 80s, they turned into these bricks, and then the 90s they started to get into smaller bricks.
Then you had stuff like this in the 2000s, and then 2010s, you really had the development of the smartphone.
You had a smartphone.
I mean, they developed before then, don't get me wrong.
The one that you just showed was a flip phone for our audience out there that's not watching.
Yeah, for the generation that doesn't know what a flip phone is, it's imagine your phone folds in half.
Hey, real quick, they're coming back to that. They're gonna make a flip phone touchscreen.
Yeah, the
Samsung.
Yeah.
And now, with this in mind as well, we can't forget to mention pagers.
Oh, the pager.
But we'll put the notes in the bottom.
It's like a today's text message, but instead of a message, it's just
letting
a notification.
It's
like, by the way, go call this person. Yeah.
And to bring up a trigger word, the Motorola Razr.
Oh.
There you go. And if you don't know what that is,
that
you
was
are not my generation.
Right. That was the old. That was
the iPhone of the time.
You're right. Exactly. That was before BlackBerry, wasn't it? Or is that during the time of
This is
BlackBerry?
during the time.
They were the those were the Android Apple
That was the Android, Apple's BlackBerry, and Razer.
and Razer, yeah.
Yeah.
Now
And not Razer the gaming company, because there is a Razer smartphone.
There is a Razer.
RAZR, right?
Now I will say though that the functionality of a phone has
R.I.P.
evolved to include more and more. Now, to me, the aesthetic of a phone isn't that important. If they only had pink phones, or they only had some really barf colored green phones, and that's what it was, I would use it.
Well, let me take a note to this.
And if there was a barf colored green phone that for whatever reason was just vastly superior in functionality, I would use that as opposed to other phones. Part of the functionality, you could say, is the aesthetic because it's small, it fits in your pocket.
Well, the thing is that, real quick, I just want to say aesthetic value, like he was just saying, is important because, as he said, if you had a choice between barf green and black, I'm pretty sure you would go with black.
But the functionality of these smartphones as miniaturized computers is much more important than how they look. And to use an example, my first smartphone was a Galaxy S4, which had a plastic back to it. I personally actually think that the plastic back is still superior to these glass backs because they don't crack.
I think that that's a very good note. I mean, glass today, it's brittle. Granted, it's Gorilla Glass. It's like sturdier. However, it still has the chance of being broken.
Can I make a quick comment on the... Because I actually just got my phone maybe 6 months ago. I got the Note 9, and when I bought it, I wanted... Way more important to me was the function of the phone. Like, 100%, I wanted every feature that it had, and more, of course, because I'm greedy. But there was only 2 color options when I bought the phone. There was a blue one with an ugly-ass yellow pen, and then there's the one that I got, which is it's called Champagne. It's like a purpley pink.
Hey, that's actually pretty cool.
I actually really like the color of it, but I cared way more about what the phone did than the fact that, because originally when they first teased it, they only showed the blue and yellow. They call it the Fortnite edition, and I was like, I'm going to get this phone, and I'm going to fucking hate the way it looks. But I love everything it does. And then they came out with the other one. I was like, oh, cool, it's more aesthetically pleasing. But I care so much more about the function.
Actually, can I bring up something?
Yeah.
One of the things which I think is really important and notes that a lot of people, not everybody, care a lot more about functionality is, let's say, my case for my Galaxy S7. My case on my Galaxy S7 is a Defender case. And I can toss my phone at the wall and it won't do anything because it's a really good case.
You know what I've noticed real quick?
Oh, I tried to catch it.
A lot. That's exactly what happens when someone has an OtterBox and they bring up the fact that it's an OtterBox. Like 8 times out of 10, they will throw it.
Now the thing about it is that this doesn't come in. At least when I bought it, didn't have a lot of colors to it. It had black and I think 1 or 2 other colors,
like gray or something.
And there's a lot of cases out there that are fandom related, they're pop culture related.
Well, like,
they look different ways.
Look at my phone. This is my phone case. It's got a funky design on it, and like
it's more of a skin than it is to protect the phone.
Right.
It does a little bit of it. It adds a little bit of functionality to the phone.
Just remember, I want personality, not trivial.
But my OtterBox
Thanks,
Defender, on the other hand, which we're not sponsored by them, so don't think that. But my OtterBox Defender strips the phone of its nice, sleek aesthetic and
gives
adds
it
a function.
Right, yeah.
And
it sacrifices aesthetic value for functional value.
To protect the phone.
And a perfect example is, mine's actually just a skin. Mine prevents scratches on the back because my back is glass, like you said. And lo and behold, even my case has less function than his, because his is a hard shell. My phone is broken. My screen is broken. And it fell, I think, 3 or 4 feet at most. I had a real skin that...
I actually have cracks on the back of my phone, and it's from before I got my case, because for a while I didn't want to spend the money on buying a case, and I just wanted...
Well, let me ask this. So, with the idea of, like, smartphones being so expensive, having such capable technologies in there that you can do literally anything you want that, like, you could do on a laptop, essentially. Why don't people opt in for the protection of it? All right? And I want to use that as a rhetorical question. Because
people are silly.
That's right.
I remember not to lampoon him right now, but I remember actually telling Robert, "Hey, get a case," because this happened to his last phone too.
I'm gonna make a shout out to my boy Rich. We're on the same phone plan. I pay for my phone, but we're on the same phone plan. And he literally told me that I better get a case on my phone because I break it a lot. And there's actually bets on when I would break my phone. Like, people took bets because they knew I wasn't going to get a case. Where was I? Oh, Rich told me to get a case because I'm clumsy and I opt into breaking my phone because I care so much about aesthetic. And my last phone was so shattered that it literally didn't function.
Well, the thing is that I wanted to mention with that, it's almost become a meme. And I mean, it actually has. Like, cracked phones. iPhones, for example. A lot of people are like, oh, your iPhone's cracked. Like, that's not surprising. Why isn't that surprising? Because people at that point do not care about the functionality of it because everyone, like, the functionality of it's reached, right?
Wait, actually, I want to bring up another point because about trading functionality. So I have this Defender phone right now, right? Defender case right now. The case that I had on here before was in fact a rechargeable case, one that could charge my phone, but
it didn't have a lot of protection.
Didn't have a lot of protection. Right. And so at the time, that's why it's cracked now, because that case fell apart. At the time, I was trading the utility and function of protection for the phone with the utility and function of having my phone be able to function and operate for longer periods of time.
And I think that's a person. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, because it's literally based off what you said. People don't care about the function of the phone, so they do, but they don't skin it, right? They don't properly protect it. And then the second it breaks, function becomes the most important thing. And they're like, my phone doesn't function.
Right, exactly.
Like,
so
it all goes back to function.
Well, and functionality and aesthetic, and I think this is a good way to segue into our next part here.
Yeah.
Functionality and aesthetic, like what is the importance of both, right? Functionality has an incredible purpose of working, right? And I think that, we've really reached that point with cars, food, phones, is the fact that it works, right? Aesthetic value is what comes after that. It's how it looks while it's doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And a lot of people care about that, especially when the market is saturated with smartphones. Everyone's either got an iPhone or an Android, right? Or something else, or something.
My grandfather has a Windows phone.
Google Pixel.
You have iPhones and not iPhones, right? But with that in mind, no.
You have Androids, iPhones, and third party.
Right, and everything else. But and a lot of people do go towards like the main focus, which is like iPhones right now, because of their look, because of the way they operate. They're not looking at the functionality of it, because there's a certain baseline functionality that everyone's reached with smartphones, right?
But also, with that in mind, it's, I think, because of our culture. Our culture cares a lot more about aesthetics than they care about functionality.
And why is that?
It partially due to our quote-unquote freedom that we have, because it's the focus on individualism in the United States.
Exactly. And I think that, and that's going to be my statement for the importance of aesthetic, is that aesthetic value is important in a culture when that culture has evolved their functions to work properly for what they need to do.
No.
We have a culture, real quick. We have a culture right now that prides itself on technological functionality, right? We have a baseline that's reached by almost like most fortunate people who are able to afford these equipments. And a lot of people do have like smart or Fitbits or smartwatches. They got Bluetooth headphones. I mean, everything kind of has that pure functionality that we're trying to reach.
Now, I will say though that although the aesthetic of this is what is above the baseline and is becoming more and more important, what Robert said about as soon as his phone cracked, he's like, shit, I wish I, had protection on it, right? That's the same thing for our culture and for aesthetic versus function in general. Mm-hmm. Because right now, most people are living in a state in which they can, at least in the United States, in which they can express themselves at least somewhat, and they have more leisure time than in some other countries, depending on where you're living. That holds up until something happens to them or happens to their family or somebody they know, in which they're suddenly without a function. And then, holy shit, everything is about
collapses.
Making sure that function is repaired. As something as simple as you living a middle-class life and you're going about your daily grind, you're doing the things you need to do, you watch television and all that, and suddenly your water's not working in your house.
And then everything goes to hell.
Everything goes to hell.
Right.
Now, for the next X amount of time, it's focused around fixing the function of your pipes, fixing the function of having running water in your house. Because at that point, you care about keeping that function up.
Mm-hmm.
So, with that in mind, function is incredibly important and represents the baseline that everybody needs function, so then they can have aesthetic. Most people aren't willing to trade function for aesthetic when it's currently detrimenting them. They're only willing to trade function for aesthetic when they don't think it's going to detriment them.
I agree. I agree.
We're going to take another short break here in a minute, so let me just real quick summarize what they're taking into point before we get back into the looser conversation. So what Silas is saying is, once things reach, like, all phones can make calls and send texts, and most smartphones can access all the same apps. There's some differences in those, but once it hits that, then aesthetic becomes super important. Right. And like in a car, if it drives and plays radio, then you can look at Mercedes and they're like, wow, that's a sexy car and stuff like that. And what Christian's saying is, once it loses its function, all of a sudden, all that matters is function. Like, when I cracked my screen, it looks like shit now, but at least it still works. Right. And now that's all I care about. So we're going to take another short break. We're just about to get into the meat and bones, the more freeform jazz session of aesthetic versus function. We were doing it a little bit before, but we're going to really get into it. So
please start with Silas.
Yeah, you want me to start?
Yeah, I do.
Open up, so go ahead.
Okay, well, all right, so I'm arguing for the importance of aesthetic in daily life. And I really find that aesthetics is important in today's culture, especially since we have evolved to a certain degree that we could have aesthetic diversity. And aesthetic taste, beauty, it's all subjective. And
beauty, kawaii, whatever you want to call it, it's all aesthetic.
Why is it important? Because it allows us to express our individuality. And especially when everything's operating at a similar level, or we have a baseline standard that we're reaching, if you want to be an individual, you have to express that in how you do things.
Express yourself.
Like Christian's fancy schmancy shirt he's got on. He's got a lot of aesthetic taste going into that, and I would say that that's a grungy aesthetic.
So no. Fuck off!
No. It's ska because he's got the bullet.
It's a punk aesthetic.
My boxers are ska.
You got some checkered.
Yeah, you didn't see.
Oh, look at that.
I apologize for the expletive, but it's punk aesthetic because it's my individuality you're messing with there, Silas. But I'm wearing, for our podcast,
with your belt chain.
For our podcast people, I'm wearing a 1970s vintage Vietnam Army, like, where is
the fatigues?
The fatigue.
I don't know what it's a shirt. It's a shirt, guys.
Shirt with buttons that have patched over with a bunch of different things that have pins. Well, I like the aesthetic. It has a lot of aesthetic, but the function is just that of a shirt.
Right.
However, Silas is wearing currently a knit, very plain sweater, which has a lot of utility in keeping him warm and making him comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
This doesn't make me as much comfortable as I just like how it looks, so I feel better. But his is more about comfort and keeping warm. And I thought that was a interesting thing to note when he showed up like that, because we are dressed opposite of how we're arguing.
Right.
Now, I'm going to argue that is actually more important than this. This is illogical. I think it's important to me, but it's illogical in a big scheme of things to just wear this, because it just really doesn't matter as much as the fact that we live in Michigan It's cold out, and that's going to keep him warm.
And I would argue the exact opposite. I think that what Christian is wearing is very logical, and what I'm wearing is very illogical in an aesthetic sense, because what Christian is wearing is defining his individual without ever saying a word. Like, you can see him walking down the street, you can already know what he is. Crazy.
You can spot Christian.
You're a wild creature.
Oh, look, it's Christian. You know?
Yeah, exactly.
You can notice him by the jacket.
I have a certain unique. I like sweaters. All right, I love sweaters. I always wear sweaters. In fact, I think in every video so far I've had a sweater. I hope it's been a different one. I don't remember. But for the most part, it's been a sweater. And that expresses my individuality. However, as a sweater itself, this is very plain, like what Christian was saying. So I think, I believe that Christian's outfit is very aesthetically not only pleasing, but it's also it's fulfilling its function of expressing his individuality, and that's the importance of aesthetic.
That's
presence.
important of fashion, really.
I mean,
fashion is very interesting because it really sometimes it goes really, really far into the avant-garde aesthetics, and then other times high fashion,
kitsch fashion. Let's wear trash bags and condoms.
and then other times it's just very practical, very pragmatic, and very utilitarian and functional.
You can get a pretty good mix of the two, honestly. I can't talk about what I'm wearing because I'm very mixed. I have very high fashion clothes on, but I also have very just functional clothes on too.
I'll use an example of a older style leather jacket. They actually have quite a bit of function to them, even though nowadays most people, you'll wear them if you wear it out because it has a fashion to it, but it also has the function of that leather's pretty tough, and if you were to get in a fight somehow, or somebody were to jump you, you wouldn't get hurt as much.
I've heard stories about people trying to get or being stabbed, but the leather preventing most of the knife going in.
Yeah.
An even more realistic example. I'm a motorcyclist myself, not super into it, but
He rides a Harley.
I don't.
He doesn't
I do not drive a Harley. I drive a fucking Asian one. So.
Kawasaki, right?
Kawasaki. Yeah. I drive a Ninja. Anyways, besides the point. I don't wear a leather jacket because I don't find them comfortable myself and I overheat, but it actually makes the most functional sense if you're on a motorcycle to wear a leather jacket.
Because it breaks the wind completely, and if you fall off, it has a lot of protection against abrasions. Right. And that's actually why jean jackets are popular too with motorcyclists, because jean is a material which prevents abrasion, but it doesn't prevent cutting as much. So with that in mind, also falling off, if you were to fall off the back of a pickup truck with a leather jacket, you wouldn't get hurt as much as if you were just wearing some thin t-shirt or something.
I do want to throw this out there in case my mom is listening. I do wear my helmet. It's ugly. It's just a black circle.
He does wear his helmet.
But I do wear my helmet because I do value my brain. Apparently I don't value the rest of my body.
Well, okay, so what's the function of a helmet? It's to protect you if you fall, right?
Yeah, if you fall, you don't... your head doesn't explode.
Right, exactly. So you're following the function of that. You're pertaining to that.
There are some with very good aesthetic though. I just don't own one.
Well, I mean, one of my buddies had a really cool one. It had the really sweet design on it. Granted, it was still the same, but all right. So I kind of want to bring it back to the meat and bones of everything. Yeah. Christian, why don't you give us the importance of functionality?
The importance of functionality is just the ability to use things for what we've defined them as. So, if I want to go and use my sink to wash my hands, it has the functionality that it's going to, if I turn it, it's going to protrude water from it, and I'm going to be able to wash my hands there.
Turn me
now,
on.
the aesthetic of it is something that is pleasing and is an option, such as if you're building a home, you want to make sure it looks nice because it's something that you enjoy. But if you didn't have that option, if you had the option between a sink that looked nice and could not have any water come out of it.
Water. You get cold water.
So a sink that doesn't work is what he's saying.
A sink that doesn't work but looks really nice.
Great, or
a sink that looks pretty ugly, doesn't match anything, but works.
I think you're gonna go with the
Most
sink that works.
people are going to go for the sink that works unless you have a lot of money,
Hopefully.
and you can just afford to have like a whole nother house someplace, or have water imported into your house to wash your hands
Pay
with.
someone to pour Fiji water over
Yes.
your hands.
But that it represents that person has enough wealth
Right.
that they don't care about the function of the sink. They only care about the aesthetic.
I think that there's a point where too much aesthetic is prevalent. Like if you're buying a gold plated or golden faucets that like rot out or whatever over time.
Buy J. Cole's watch for $800,000.
That's really
It
excessive.
just tells time, damn it.
Now, again, with that though, an interesting question that I would like to bring up for Silas is, if an object which is supposed to have a utility to it forgoes that utility for aesthetic, is it really even still that object? Is it real? If a sink doesn't have water or isn't able to be turned on for water, is it really even still a sink? I mean, you would call it that.
Let me say
but
this.
Isn't it the function that defines what it is?
Well, yeah, let me say this. Back in the 1900s, early 1900s, Marcel Duchamp did this with an art fair in New York, where they opened it up to anyone to bring in whatever art they wanted to bring in. He brought in a urinal and called it art because he was in protest of the idea. He's like, oh, only art should be in an art show. Like, it has to be art. No one can just enter in their stuff. And I could diverge on that, but like to kind of stay on track. I agree with Christian and with Marcel Duchamp to a certain degree. Functionality is important, all right? Functionality, in fact, comes first. If you're designing anything, if you're creating something, it's going to have a functionality towards it.
Barring jewelry and...
Well, what's the function of that? It's to look good. So
Well,
the function of that is actually for an aesthetic purpose.
It is for an aesthetic purpose.
It's making that a note, regardless of whether it looks like crap or not.
Now, I will say though that depending on culture, the aesthetic itself, even though in a positivist sense it doesn't really matter, but depending on culture, a lot of aesthetics are what influence other people, and that itself is a function.
Right.
The ability to, back in the day, the ability to have really nice jewels for the noble class was something that if you were to walk around as a noble, you would strike kind of fear, or you would strike fear into the hearts of those peasants, because they see this person who is very aesthetically pleasing. And I will give an example which involves actually direct functionality of aesthetic, and that is within the idea of what a pirate was back in the day. The reason, and I took a history class and there was a lesson on this, but the reason that pirates used to talk in like the pirate jargon, how they speak, and dress how they did with all the big blouses and the jewels and that type of a look, was an intimidation factor for making vessels that they captured stand down without a fight. Because the way that they talked and the way that they dressed was similar to how nobility dressed, and the jargon they used was essentially a different language. And so when they captured a vessel,
They wanted to, yes.
that vessel would stand down because how intimidating it was to see these fancily dressed people telling them that they were going to be killed if they didn't stand down.
Right.
I want to hear more about...
Okay, so no, you're good. I think that Christian is really saying something important, is that there is an aesthetic purpose, right? Certain things hold, like what it was. It's objects, events, or state of affairs that hold beauty, art, taste. It also holds a certain communication, right? That's what beauty, art, and taste is. It's a communication between an object and the viewer. What Christian was saying with the pirates, and what like Robert was saying, I think, with like nobility. No, that was also Christian. Everything together, there is a purpose for aesthetic, and it's very prevalent in anything. Phones today, jewelry all the time throughout history,
Cars.
hell, even
Food.
the way you dress. All right, and that's been a thing since we figured out how to dress differently than just lamb's clothes or whatever, lambskin.
I'll say that even at the time, you probably had people who, I mean, you did. You have people who would dye their clothes different colors.
Right.
But
like that was the start of it, right? Yeah. So like that was the beginning evolution of aesthetic value. And what's really important though is that whenever you have a functionality that's reached, and this is a good point that I want to bring up, every time you find that function then evolves into an aesthetic form, right? So the way a car works, the way that phones work, the way that you prepare food, all becomes part of that aesthetic. Why? It's because we understand the function, we reached it, and then we're moving beyond that into individual taste.
Yeah, to please the individual.
Exactly. So, I just kind of want to wrap up my idea of aesthetic and give a nod towards function. Functionality is very important. All right, it's what defines what we make, right? And once that's reached, aesthetic always comes after that. All right, if it works, someone's gonna make it work better. Someone's gonna make it work different. There's all sorts of ways that aesthetic, personal taste can be reached.
Yeah. So I guess I'll just do a quick conclusion.
Yeah.
So the way I look at it is exactly what Silas is saying, and I don't think Christian was disagreeing. They're both very important, but function always comes first, because you can't design something to look nice if you don't know what it's going to do. It's got to complete a task or whatever, and then appeal to the individual or the crowd or whatever you're marketing to. So you can't have one without the other. I guess you could have raw function more than you can have raw aesthetic, but a lot of people, especially in our culture now, it's a lot more prevalent because we have evolved to want things that appeal to our personal taste. It's more aesthetics taking a bigger picture than it used to. It's just more prevalent in today's time.
Now, on a closing note from me, I will say that I think that aesthetic can be very prevalent in a variety of different objects due to the fact that as we continue to advance our technology, the function of things that we use grows. And so that additional function can be traded for more aesthetic as the base function continues to grow. So if you have a phone and the computers in it can be more smaller and smaller, then you can start to do other things with that additional space.
And that's really the way that everything has gone. Yeah. And so whatever we kind of figured out today, I guess that functionality and aesthetic are both very important.
They are. They're both incredibly important.
For everything. For anything, like any sort of operation.
And they're married. The ideas are married. Very hand-in-hand subject, aesthetic and function. They go together. Naturally, they go together.
And they're a progression. They're a natural progression from having nothing to creating something that has a utility, to improving upon that utility to the point in which now you can add something additional to it, which adds more individualistic enjoyment.
That Silas' whole baseline thing, you kept hearing him say baseline function, that is what he's saying.
Yeah, the quintessential parts of function
it
once
does
they're reached.
What it's supposed to, and now we can make it
more personal.
So that's going to be the end of this, at least for now.
Yeah, let us know if you guys want us to continue. I mean, Christian and I did a lot of research into this, so there's a lot more that we can talk about.
We can do a second part to this.
Let us know, though.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Again, Rob.
Christian.
And Silas.
And remember to like and subscribe, or whatever it is in the format we're using at the time.
Yeah, and this has been...
Whatever aesthetic it is.
Yeah. This has been the Graeyzone. Really hope you enjoyed this episode.
Yeah, let us know what you think.
Anyways, thank you so much.
Have a great day. Signing out.
Au revoir.